a lot of the speeches you talk about in the book are historical. You talk about having multiple speeches that fit the moment. And you even talk about the speech that was given by Martin Luther King. He was there, and John Lewis was there in August of 1963. Talk about that a little bit and what you found when you dug into that research wise.
Yeah, so this is the first chapter in the book, and I talk about Martin Luther King and John Lewis at that famous March on Washington, and neither of them quite gave the speech they wanted to give. John Lewis, for those who don't know, was at the time very young. He was in his 20s. He was leading a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was kind of the activist group in the civil rights movement. And he almost didn't want to speak. He basically said, this whole event is too, it's the old guys, it's powerful, it's labor unions, it's not activist. They're calling it a march. They're calling it a march on Washington. It feels more like a march in Washington. And his advisor said, okay, but you gotta talk. And he said, okay, but if I do, I'm going to put some sting into it, some sting. And boy, did he ever. His draft had lines like, we're going to march through the South, through the heart of Dixie, the way Sherman did. We're going to pursue our own scorched earth policy and burn Jim Crow to the ground. He called patience a dirty and nasty word. He said he couldn't support Kennedy's civil rights bill. And this caused an absolute uproar. The march was really very delicate. There were a lot of different speakers. There were a lot of different people who had to be satisfied. Most importantly, President Kennedy, who wanted to be supportive of the civil rights movement, but was kind of back and forth on it. He was late to that game. And so here comes Lewis in his mid-20s, and he just wants to give a stinging, fiery speech. And the night before, his draft started circulating, and people freaked out. And part of why I put this chapter first is one of my jobs has been helping oversee speechwriting at conventions, Democratic convention, business conventions. Right. And it is so hard, even when everyone is nominally on the same page, to recognize that people have their own agendas. And John Lewis's agenda was the young person's agenda. And so everyone begged him, John, please change your remarks. Please change your remarks. Martin Luther King went to John Lewis and said, John, this doesn't sound like you. And Lewis said, yeah, but it sounds like us. It sounds like the young people. And so finally what happened is A. Philip Randolph, who's kind of the grandfather of the movement, basically begged Lewis with tears in his eyes. And Lewis said, how could I say no? Saying no to A. Philip Randolph would be like saying no to Mother Teresa. And so in the book, I found this amazing photo of John Lewis kind of retreating at the March on Washington. And he's sitting under Abraham Lincoln's arm in the Lincoln Memorial, furiously rewriting his speech to make it okay for A. Philip Randolph. And so what I say in this chapter, and by the way, each chapter is not just about the undelivered speech, it's about the drama of that moment, the back and forth, why things went one way or the other. And what I say in that chapter is, what if people, instead of hearing about the dream, heard about the nightmare? Because John Lewis wanted to tell them about the nightmare. And Dr. King didn't really want to tell him about the dream. He had given a version of the I Have a Dream speech hundreds of times before the March on Washington. And his advisors wanted him to give a much stronger speech that they called Normalcy Never Again. In other words, America's never going to return to normalcy. This is our new normal. Like, deal with it. And at the end of his speech, King later said, the toughest part about giving a speech is like you're flying around in circles and you don't know where to land. And he didn't know where to land. And so he sort of cut off the end of his prepared remarks and decided he was going to land with this I Have a Dream riff that he had done many times before. And so afterwards, King's advisors were kind of frustrated. They felt like he had done sort of a warmed over greatest hits album. And I remind speakers when I talk to them that it's the 100th time you say the exact same thing that people finally listen. So King didn't want to tell them about the dream. John Lewis wanted to tell them about the nightmare. And if each of them had had their way, it would have been a very, very different march.
Yeah. It's interesting that one thing is planned, another thing is done, and then that clearly has got to be on the short list of the most famous, moving, memorable speeches ever given. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's funny, right? Because it almost didn't happen.
I think people look at the way history treats leaders. We look at these people as though they're some way bigger than life and they have some vision that shows them outcomes that we can't see. And I think people sometimes think that they're less than because they're conflicted, because they don't see a clear path at the time. And they would think, well, this should be clear to me. It isn't always clear to these leaders. They are conflicted down to the minute they step up to the mic. Sometimes they don't know which speech or which paragraph or whether to read what's in the parentheses or not. They're fallible just like everyone else. It's not like they've got some special code that gives them the outcome before anybody else knows it. Everybody has those conflicts.
Absolutely. And I think one of the examples of that I love in this book is Dwight Eisenhower at, right before D-Day. And he did this before every engagement in battle. He wrote an apology. He basically imagined, what if D-Day goes the other way? What if it fails? And he apparently, this was one of the things he did. He would do it before every engagement battle. He'd fold it up, put it in his wallet. Things went well. He'd tear it up, throw it in the trash can. This one, D-Day, he kept in his wallet for weeks and weeks, found it later, tossed it in the trash can. His personal aide said, no, this one's probably a keeper. But this idea, later on, years later, he was asked about this failure speech. And he said, what was I going to do? Hide from it? I had planned this thing. I had set it in motion. Success or failure, that was going to be on me, and there'd be no sense trying to hide from it. So I planned everything. I hoped for the best, but I also was prepared to accept the worst because I still thought it was the right thing to do. And so it's a very, very short speech, but it is such a perfect lesson in the language of leadership, of responsibility taking, and of confidence.
Yeah, when I was doing press readiness with CEOs, for example, just to get away from politics for a minute, I always told them, don't get CEO-itis where you feel like you have to know the answer to everything. You don't. But you can say, as a leader, I don't know why they did that. And I'm not sure exactly what the process was, but I can tell you I didn't do it, but I support the people who did. I'm the leader. I didn't do it, but I support the people who did. I hired them. They work for me. I stand behind them. I didn't do it, but I support those who did. Leaders have to step up. And I think one of the themes of this book was that these people were fallible. They did have multiple speeches. They did have doubts. They weren't sure, but they still took action.
And the one thing I'll add to that, I love your example of counseling CEOs, is I often think it's really important for leaders to say the thing that only they can say. In other words, what is their connection with this? I had a boss who used to say, if someone started spouting something that sounded like it was written by a lawyer or sounded like it was written by someone else, they would say, blue suit, red tie, here to lie. And I always say, you don't want to be blue suit, red tie, here to lie. Think about how you actually react as a person before you start thinking about your position. And so that I think I would, if I add to your CEO advice, I think that those things in combination are very important and very powerful.
It's funny, I've watched juries time and again respond to them taking ownership, to saying, I don't know, but then owning what they do know and being human beings about it. People know the truth when they hear it.
Absolutely.
I've believed that for a long, long time. We're at a different phase. And 2 years ago, I had never even heard the word Zoom. And now we've got people in corporate America, in politics, in all different walks of life that are having to deliver what are intended to be powerful messages to a little dot on their computer.
Yeah.
They can't even look at the screen to see the gallery of people because then they're not making eye contact. They've got to look at the little camera to the side. What's the impact of this? And do you think we're ever going to get back to the real eye contact, personal interaction that we ever saw?
No, I love this question because I had to help oversee speech writing for the first national political convention that was totally on Zoom. And this was the 2020 political convention. And one of the things we found out very quickly is 5 minutes is a long time. There were more 3 and 2 minute speeches than there had ever been before. The idea of 10 or 12 minutes face to camera, really, really difficult. The other thing you realize is it's not only the words that matter. Location sends a message, backdrop sends a message. You get to be
Right.
a little bit of a cinematographer, right? We joke about all of our curated backdrops, but here I put a book over my shoulder, hoping people say, "Oh, that's what the cover looks like." But um, but it is really, really tough to hold an audience on a screen, and it's a skill. And so we found shorter, shorter is better. Um, much more direct, much more produced. Don't use words to say everything. Use examples. The most memorable part of the convention was when we did the 50 state roll call and the camera went to every different state. In Rhode Island, you had a guy holding, a plate of calamari. It's like, you know, show something. If the goal of a speech is to persuade by being a person who sort of has enough personality to be persuasive, in Zoom, you can find other ways to do a little bit of that work that the words don't need to carry everything.
You make a point in the book about this, and it is true that we tend to talk at about, I don't know, 120, 130 words a minute. I say my wife has gust up to about 160 sometimes. But when you don't have the room and you don't have noise and you don't have applause and you don't have reactions, you can cover a lot more verbal ground in a minute than you can otherwise. If you're just talking to a camera without all of that feedback and noise, you can get up to, well, you say in the book 150, 60, 70 words a minute. So you can get a lot more said in less time.
You can, although I will say there's no substitute for that feedback, for the energy in the room. And so this gets back to your original question, like, are we going to go back to in person? I think in many ways we are. I was just took my daughters to a concert the other night, and they were blown away, and they said, like, the energy, it's not just the music, right? It's the energy. And so, a lot of when we gather to speak to each other, to rally together, yeah, it's the words, but also it's that feeling of common cause. And I think that's one of the things we're craving and getting back to a little bit.